Hello, everyone. So, still going through World War One, from books that were written actually in between World War One and World War Two, like that one right there. And I wanted to kind of talk about something that book refers to as the world suddenly turned upside down. So, the war was fought for a lot of reasons, which we covered in a previous video that's on the playlist. But it kind of started without a whole lot of warning, right? So people were just like, okay, we're not at war, boom, we're at war, right? The Archduke was assassinated, people mobilized, and off and running. Communication wasn't what it is today. This was more than 100 years ago. So people got caught in the middle of this war zone. People were on vacation, people were traveling. It was Europe, right? So you had people over there, as tourists. And as soon as it broke out, there was kind of widespread loss of public morale. So it war breaks out, bullets start flying. All of a sudden, people are freaking out. They're trying to get out of that war zone. And if you think about it for a minute, people went from being millionaires to overnight to being kind of bankrupt because stock markets crashed. You had banks kind of not honoring deposits. You had all kinds of problems. Imagine being a civilian stuck inside one of these war zones that long ago. You can't just go to Expedia and get an airplane ticket. Didn't exist, right? You can't just like, hey, let's go get on the superhighway, take the tollway, right, and get to where we want to go. Didn't exist. Uh, Travel was a real problem by comparison to what it is today, especially when things stopped working. A lot of travel was by train or other sort of local means, but railroads were really the big one. Railroads, and if you're traveling between continents, it was ship. Uh, and railroads across Germany, France, Austria, and Russia were seized kind of for purposes of moving war equipment, material, and people around. So if you're in Paris, you're stuck. And what do I mean stuck? What's life like as a refugee that long ago, right? So you're stuck, right? This is what you're facing. It's like, I want to get out of town. I can't. Hotels are booked. I can't go to the bank and cash a check because they're not honoring checks. They're not honoring travelers' checks. Those sorts of things don't work. So you wind up with people sort of sitting on the sidewalk going, I don't have anywhere to go. People were in London, people, which wasn't torn up by the war, but there were 5,000 citizens stranded in London begging for the embassy for help for safe passage home. And they wound up in situations like this because they had no money. They had no way to get anywhere. It just didn't work the way things were supposed to. So, you have to kind of go, what do we do? Women, kids, and refugees were wanting to get out of the war zones, and sometimes they were told, "Okay, that way, start walking a couple hundred miles. Good luck." Right? Many Americans were caught so short-handed without money and banks and other things that the U.S. decided, "Hey, we got a way to fix this. We'll send them gold because everybody honors gold, right? Tried and true, always works." At least then there was still a gold standard, so it was a lot different world. So they decided to take and mobilize the Navy. Now, they mobilized the Navy for a couple of things. First was to make sure that the neutrality of U.S. ports was guaranteed and that you could get some safe travel on the oceans because those things weren't necessarily working as well as they used to either. Ships were getting sunk left and right. And but to help some of the refugees out, the U.S. government took $7.5 million in gold and put it on an armored cruiser named Tennessee. They did this on August 6th, 1914, and sent it over to Europe and said, okay, here's some money for the Americans that are there to try to get them home, right? So that's the level they had to go to try to sort this whole thing out. And the refugee thing that we see today when we look at war zones is bad, right? If you look around and say, how do people get out of these spaces? Well, we got to especially get some airplanes over there. We got to call the Red Cross. We got to do this. We got to do that. And it's still a problem even today. Imagine it 110 years ago. How much harder would it have been for people to get out of those zones? Next to impossible, right? So some people were just kind of stuck there. Some people did get out, but some people did wind up getting caught in the crossfire. That still happens even today. But imagine it 110 years ago. Imagine it when you're told, "Hey, you, women, kids, whoever, just start walking. You'll get there in a week, couple of weeks, right? No problem." Maybe there's food along the way. Maybe it'll be charity. Maybe not, because you can't really buy it because you don't have any cash. So yeah, people were turned away from hotels. They were turned away from places to stay, and by and large, it was a lot harder world to move around in than it is today. So when this war broke out, It was a real problem. And when you see the challenges that we face today with war zones, and everybody goes, "Oh, this is comparable to previous world wars. We're just in another one." Well, no, it's really not. This was a lot different problem than we face today. This was it was a whole lot harder to solve. So you know, the wars we have today are not nearly as large scale as this one was. They don't tend to be, and we tend to have a little bit of fair warning, and our communication systems are better, so people do sometimes get out of the way. So you know, it uh, this particular war fascinates me because I think it's one that people kind of forget. And my intent with these videos is to go from sort of this World War One era, which you see in the video behind me, up to modern day, and say, look, how has warfare really changed? Not from a how do we kill each other perspective. That's a whole different set of things, but from a more public perception, more public impact kind of way, to say, look, here's what the impact of that war was. Here's why it was fought. Here was the result of combat. There's enough videos out there on, hey, look, let's talk about the Battle of the Bulge, for 5 hours that you don't need me to do that. But what problems did those things solve? And are we still seeing those same problems today? And World War One, the refugee crisis, do we still see refugee crisis today? Absolutely. Do we still see it the same way? Not at the same scale, but I would argue that some of the same things do still occur, because if you don't have cash, getting out is going to be tough, right? If you have cash, you can do it. But you got to be careful what happens because they may not honor your US dollars. They may only honor gold. They may honor something else. And there were parts of Europe where even if you had a ton of cash on you, even if it was local currency, they'd be like, who cares? It's a war zone. I don't need your money. I'm worried about whether or not I live and breathe tomorrow, right? So cash stops having as much meaning as we're used to. So think about that for a minute. If you're stuck in a war zone, does all the money in the world really matter, or are you just there for survival purposes and money is sort of tomorrow's problem? Everybody have a great day. We'll talk again soon.